Why should you learn and practice Wohlfahrt's Etude number 39 from book number 2? Hello to my fellow instrumentalists who have already subscribed to the channel, and hi to the rest of you who haven't yet. I'm Jacques Gadway, and this is Gadway Violin. In today's video, we're taking a look at Wohlfahrdt's Etude number 39 from his book number 2. This etude, for a long time, was the bane of my violin existence. And that's because it works on something that's not super glamorous with violin playing, but is actually very difficult. And that is simply just bow control. Throughout this etude at a moderato tempo, we are meant to slur every single measure one bar at a time. All the while, we need to move through very smooth arpeggios, and if you want to execute this etude at its most difficult level, you also have to play it as loudly as you can. This means not only do you have to make sure that you're saving and conserving bow throughout, but that you keep the dynamic up and that you maintain good phrasing. This means that often you have to go against the tendency of the bow in order to really bring out the shape of the line. The tendency of the bow being, of course, that as you get to the tip, the bow gets lighter, and therefore the volume gets less. As you get to the frog, the exact opposite is true. With that, let's take a look at this etude and talk about some things that we can think about and work on so that we can play it without all this enormous tension that I know that can be generated when practicing this etude. The first thing that I'd like to point out is that the bowing at the very beginning, as I played it, is as printed. It's written such that we slur just 2 beats at a time in the first 2 measures, and then we move to slurring every single bar. In my opinion, this is just to indicate the optional bowings that you can do. I don't think that we necessarily need to start from the beginning with that exact bowing that's written and then move to a different bowing. I think it means that the entire etude can be played with that bowing or the next. That being said, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to play it exactly as written, but in your practice, feel free to experiment. Remember that etudes are meant to serve us. We are not meant to serve etudes, which means that you don't need to do everything that's exactly written. We don't play etudes to historically bring back to life that which has been written in the past, like we do with a lot of repertoire. Rather, we use it to get better at the violin. So we're going to do what's necessary with this etude to make sure that we benefit the most. That might mean that we first learn the entire etude with the bowing as printed in the first 2 measures, meaning we slur just every 2 beats rather than every single measure. What glorious freedom that entails. When you do this bowing, you'll feel a lot more free, and as a result, you'll probably have a fair amount less tension in your back and in your shoulders. For me, this etude's all about making sure we can have sustained sound, sostenuto, all while not having excess tension. So the first technique and thing we should focus on is the idea that when we play at the frog, our bow is actually too heavy. You may recall this exercise. If not, this may be your first time, and I'll show you. Start at the tip of the bow, and you're going to do an up bow, removing entirely every finger except for the middle finger and thumb. If you play an up bow from this point, and you just go all the way to the frog, you'll notice something. For most every single bow, and most every single violinist, when you do this, at some point the violin will croak and the bow will essentially be too heavy to create a good sound on the instrument. At what point in the bow does this happen? It actually happens at a specific point. It happens right when we cross the balance point. It's because at this point, when we cross the balance point, the top part of the bow is officially heavier than the bottom. We've crossed the balance point, so now we have more weight of the bow on this side of the instrument than we have on our hand side. which means that the bow begins to crush the string. If that's all it takes to crush the string, then by that logic, the string can really only take a very minute amount of pressure, which means the idea of playing loudly or forte should not require us to press very hard at all. So the first concept that we should think about when learning this etude is that whenever we're especially below the balance point, but in the lower half in general, we should think about not adding any pressure at all to the bow, and rather allowing the bow to use its natural weight, and if anything, our arm to add a tad bit of natural weight to actually get that depth of sound. We never want to feel like we're pressing down if we're in the lower half of the violin. Of course, at the tip, where the bow is the lightest, we may feel like we need to add some pressure with that index finger in order to accommodate and make sure that we don't fall into the trap of allowing the bow to do what's natural, which is to play softer at the tip and heavier at the frog. So with that, as we play these whole bows, whether we slur 2 beats or entire measures, we should feel that transfer of responsibility. We should feel like we're allowing the bow to be heavy during the frog, we're not adding weight, and that once we get to a point where we need to add some weight, we start to deliver it with that index finger. The slower you go with this etude, the more difficult it will be to not get crunches. Let's skip ahead to the third line, where we start on an A natural. This is the third measure of the third line. All the while I play through this, I have to constantly remind myself, and you probably will too, that I don't need to press any harder. It's important to accept how loud your violin can play given a certain bow speed. There actually is a limit. I like to remind myself that we're not forcing sound out of the instrument, rather we're inviting it out. We're inviting the full potential out of our instrument. And remember that different instruments have different potentials. Different bows have different abilities as well. So if you hear someone playing on a very fancy modern instrument and they're blasting away, it actually might not be possible for your instrument to reproduce that exact decibel. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to pull out a healthy sound yourself, but really you should be striving within the bounds of your instrument what sound you can pull out. I don't want you to limit yourself in your creativity and your thinking, but I do want you to somewhat temper your expectations. Remember that the violin is an extremely complex instrument. It's extremely expensive, especially at the highest levels. If you're playing on an instrument that's somewhere in the realm of a few $100s to $5,000 even, that instrument most likely is not going to be capable of the same colors and decibels as, let's say, a $500,000 violin. That doesn't mean it's not worthwhile to practice different colors and to make sure that you understand the true maximum volume that it can play, but it does mean that you should prevent yourself from feeling very tense in the body while trying to struggle to bring out a sound that instrument just simply can't do. Every instrument does have a maximum volume that it can achieve. Again, I don't mean to say this to make you feel limited. I mean to say this to make you feel a little bit more confident and comfortable in what's happening when you produce your sound. Don't allow yourself to feel overly tense or struggle when you're trying to produce a sound out of the instrument that's simply just not there. My instrument, for example, has a maximum volume of close to 94 decibels. It's not a very loud instrument. I make well sure that I get all of those 94 decibels every time that I play at my maximum volume, but I try my best not to try and exceed that level of force, and I certainly try not to develop any tension as I do so. Whenever I revisit this etude, however, it's a constant reminder that I do not have that absolutely perfected, and I don't really think many violinists do. Practicing this etude and revisiting it over time is a great way to reinforce this idea that we need to play without tension and we need to invite the sound out of the instrument. At some point, you can only get louder on the violin by playing with more bow. And if you have restriction on bow usage, like this makes us do, by making us slur an entire measure, we have to conserve bow. They're simply only so loud we can play. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to be playing at your max volume already. Most likely, it'll take great workshopping and an immense amount of practice on this etude to discover what your maximum is at certain bow speeds. Understand that you can change all sorts of variables in order to find out what that maximum is. Be careful to be satisfied with your volume production too early on, because I'm certain it will be quite loud even at a slow tempo. If you find that the sound coming out of your instrument doesn't feel loud at all, it's most likely still a skill problem and requires more tweaking to the variables of bow technique. What are those variables? Of course, they're the same as we always talk about in these videos. They are bow speed, which we can't fix because we are on a fixed bow speed. We have a fixed amount of bow that we can use because we have to do the slurs. But there's also sounding point, which is how close or far from the bridge we can be. We generally want to have a close to the bridge sounding point when we're playing with a very slow and controlled bow. And then finally, of course, there's pressure. We need to make sure that we don't feel like our hand is applying the same amount of pressure when we're at the frog versus when we're at the tip. We want to find what that happy, perfect amount of pressure is to invite the most sound out of our instrument. That is going to feel different at the frog than it is at the tip, and every space in between. We need to find what that variation is as we're on the G string in a low position. First, when we're on the E string in a high position. This too will change the requirements. The only thing that will truly develop your comfort in this concept is by practicing and repeating this concept over and over again. And there's no place better to do it than by practicing Wohlfahrt's Etude number 39.